So, welcome to 2025 Kanban Coaching Exchange, everybody. I'm glad to see that you've all made it back to us, and hopefully you all had a fantastic Christmas and a happy new year. I think I'm still allowed to say that because it is still January. But it's good to see everybody back, kicking off our first session of the year with a bang. And I'd love to introduce you to Sarah. Now, Sarah is a psychologist, a coach, and she works with lots of individuals, teams, and organizations to help build resilience and collaborative cultures in the way that they work. Sarah works for a company called Spring Insight, and she's been doing this many years and very passionate about her craft. And we wanted to bring you something a little bit different because transformation and change is not always about the process, the tool, the thing that you use. Actually, there's a lot of mindset and behavioral stuff that has to come in here as well. So we thought that this was a great opportunity to introduce this topic. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to you, Sarah. Take it away.
Thanks, Helen. So first of all, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, super. Thank you very much for making time in your day to join this presentation, and hopefully it will be worth your while. I've got quite a lot of content I'm going to share with you, so let's see how we go. And the other thing I wanted to say was it's been such a delight putting this presentation together, because a lot of what I do is work with teams and individuals in more of a kind of group workshop type format. So it's a slightly different medium for me, and it's been quite an opportunity to bring together some of the different tools and insights that I use from neuroscience. So the focus of the talk is really about self-leadership. So often when we go to talks which are around navigating change, it comes from the perspective of, okay, I'm a leader in an organization. What can I do to help the change be successful? But actually, a lot of what I'm interested in is, what can I do for myself? How can I stay resilient? And how can I adapt to the change? So I'm coming really from that self-leadership perspective. Okay, so hopefully the slide has just changed for you. So just to say something about who I am, Helen's already done a lovely introduction, but I'm a psychologist and a coach. I'm particularly interested in collaboration and resilience. I'm actually also training to be a breath worker, which is about using the breath for calming the nervous system and what we might call things like intuitive knowing. And I'm also involved in resilience away days, a lot of which are in nature-based settings, because I have a real affinity of being out in nature. So it was Heraclitus, who you may have heard of. We have to reference him, an ancient Greek philosopher who's credited with saying that change is the only constant in life. And what he meant by this is that everything is always in a state of flux and flow. And actually, that's a really wonderful thing. It keeps life interesting, but sometimes it can be quite stressful. And you'll often hear people talking about a VUCA world, an increasingly VUCA world, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, especially in the world of business. So change may be the only constant in life, and change also has many benefits. Yet transitioning through change is often known to be quite a challenging thing. I don't think it has to be challenging. Some of us will embrace change. Some of us will enjoy change, even if when it's been thrust upon us and we haven't chosen it. But a lot of us, even when we have chosen it, or even when we see it as a positive thing, might still find it, quite difficult to adjust or have some challenges around that. So our ability to be resilient and to be able to adapt is really important. They're probably two of the most sought after skills to lead a kind of happy life, happy and balanced life. So my objectives for today really is to understand the functions of the brain and the nervous system and our human responses to change, what the neuroscience tells us about our human responses to change, and also to share some of the tools that I've liked and that I've used over the years that can help us to maintain that resilience. So I'm assuming, because we'll be looking at things like the change curve, circle of control. So I imagine Maslow's hierarchy, I imagine a lot of these things will be things that you've already come across. And if they are, then hopefully it will just serve as a nice reminder. Perhaps they'll be framed slightly differently within the flow of the presentation. So my idea is roughly to talk for about 45 minutes, and we will stop at a couple of points for some self-reflection and group conversation. There is one breathwork, 2-minute breathwork exercise that I'm going to introduce shortly. At the end of the presentation, my idea is that we have a short optional breakout where you'll just be invited to explore in smaller groups what's resonated with you, and then we'll come back for the final part of the session for some group conversation. So as we move through, feel free to put questions into the chat, or you can save them for the end. Also, might be handy to have a pen and paper. We'll share the presentation with you at the end. If you feel comfortable, great to keep your camera on, but I'm sure, you know, some of us would prefer to keep the cameras off, and that's absolutely fine too. So just whatever's going to make you feel most comfortable. So just as we get going into the presentation, I'd just like to invite you to think about the last big change that you went through. Did you choose that change? And just some words to describe your experience. Just be really interesting to hear how people in this forum have experienced change. So was it a positive thing? Was it anxiety inducing? Maybe there was a mixture of experiences. Kim, it was done to you. Was that organisational? I'm interested.
Yeah, that was a big organisational change that was done to a lot of people, but even prior to that, the biggest change within that organisation was done to us rather than included us.
Yeah, did you manage to navigate through it?
Yes, I just come out the other end.
Yeah,
9 months.
Yeah. I went through a huge organisational shift about 8 or 10 years ago, and it was only afterwards that I realised how difficult it was. I think sometimes when you're in the moment, you just sort of get on with it, don't you, and make do, and then later on you realise how stressed you were. I don't know if anybody relates to that idea.
Yeah, lots of ups and downs, and definitely relate to the change curve.
Mm-hmm. So let's just have a look at some of the other comments that are coming through. Okay, I'm often the one pushing more for change than half the people are ready for. That's interesting comment as well. One of the things we'll be looking at is that because change creates uncertainty, our natural brain response is to be sometimes quite fearful of that, or to feel quite threatened by that. Whereas if we're the one that's responsible for the change, then obviously we've had more time to adjust and prepare. And sometimes when we're responsible for the change, we can almost forget that the other people who are newer to the change need a much longer period to get used to it. And of course, that's one of the things that the change curve teaches us. So I'll keep looking at those comments as they come in, but I'll move us on with the presentation. So we're going to begin to explore a little bit about the brain and the nervous system. And I'm going to explore this from the point of view, I'm going to try and make the case for kind of 5 brain-based fundamentals. The first one is this idea that we have a primal purpose in life to survive. And that means that we're always scanning for safety through a process of neuroception. So we know the idea of perception, perceiving things, but neuroception is the idea at the neuronal level, the neuron level, often below the level of consciousness. We're scanning the environment to check that it's safe. The second principle is this idea that change is just hard. We tend to favour certainty and predictability because it means that we can plan, and we like to plan. Our rational brain likes to plan, our emotional brain likes to plan. And so it can just be a difficult thing. And because of that, we need to allow ourselves time and try to be patient and compassionate with ourselves and with other people. It's one of the reasons why organisational change programmes often fail, because they try to push it through too quickly. And the other principle I'm going to talk about is that our emotional brain can dominate our logical. So if you've come across the chimp paradox, book, that's one of the things that is talked about. That's the focus of the book, really, that we have this chimp, this emotional part of our brain, and we have this logical part of our brain, and ideally they both work in harmony. But when they're not in harmony, usually the emotions win. The emotions tend to be stronger. So we're going to be exploring that and what that means in terms of change. And then we're going to be looking at Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, the Daniel Kahneman book. He talks about how our logical brain, system one, tends to take shortcuts, which again is a really, really positive thing. But again, we've got to be quite careful of that because it can create bias, and it can cause us to create false narratives in response to change. And then finally, we're going to be looking at brain plasticity and the idea that we can influence how our brain and nervous system evolve. And for each of these, I'm going to suggest a couple of tools that we could try out for ourselves or offer to other people if we're supporting other people through change. So I want to start with the story of Phineas Gage, who you either can see, Tomo, you're nodding, who lived in the 1800s. And he was an American railroad construction supervisor. So in 1848, at the age of 25, he was directing a work team and they were building a new railway and they were blasting through the rock. And unfortunately, when he rammed in the gunpowder, a spark was ignited and it created an explosion. And what happened was that a long rod, I think it was about 1 meter long, went right through his skull. So what was amazing about this incident was that Phineas actually made what seemed to be a full recovery. So physically, he was walking around, he could talk, he could interact, he could do manual work. But actually, there was a radical shift in his personality. So he started, he became quite unreliable, he became quite aggressive. It was difficult for him to have relationships with people. Sadly, he split from his wife. But what was interesting about this is it got neuroscientists and scientists thinking about, okay, so that's really interesting. There must be different parts of the brain that do different things. And so if we sort of fast forward, what we now know is that different parts of the brain, we could say, are involved in different functions. And the brain tends to be split into 4 different areas. So we've got the frontal lobe at the front of our head, which is around higher order functions and logical thinking. We've got the temporal lobe, which is about memories, and we've also got much of the emotional structures in the brain. So this area is also a lot to do with emotional processing. We've got the parietal lobe, which takes in sensory information and processes that information and integrates it. We've got the occipital lobe, which is about vision. The cerebellum, which is to do with motor control and mobility. And then we've got the brain stem that connects down to the spinal cord. And in reality, this is quite a simple overview of the brain. In reality, what's more important is the way different parts of the brain connect through the neural network, which we'll talk about a bit later. So as well as the brain, we've also got the nervous system, which we could roughly say is to split into 3 parts. So we've got the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. We've got the peripheral nervous system, which connects the central system out to the limbs and the organs. And then you might have come across the autonomic nervous system, which is basically all of our largely unconscious and automatic kind of basic body functions like digestion, heart rate, respiration and arousal. And it's this, the autonomic nervous system that's activated when we get into fight or flight. You might have, if you do yoga or anything like that, you might have heard of the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which are 2 parts of the autonomic nervous system. But essentially, the autonomic nervous system can either be calm or it can be activated. And we kind of want both of those things, right? But we don't want to be too activated, which would be fight or flight. And we don't want to be activated too much of the time. So because so much of us tend to be quite activated in everyday life, the focus of this often tends to be about calming the autonomic nervous system. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in breath work, because a lot of the aspects of the autonomic nervous system we can't actually control. It's very difficult to have any control over what our heart is doing, Sorry, we can control that through things like the breath, but digestion or arousal and things like this. But however, the thing we do have control over is the way that we breathe. And because of the mind-body connection, the way that we breathe will actually impact the way that we think, and vice versa. The way that we think will actually impact the way that we breathe and impact our body. So when I'm thinking about the way that we respond to change, I'm going to be thinking about kind of the brain, but also our whole system. And coming on to this idea of neuroception that I mentioned earlier. So our whole nervous system is incredibly sensitive, complex, and intelligent. And it's constantly scanning the environment through this process of neuroception, which is basically a subconscious threat detection system happening. So it's happening below the level of consciousness. So literally our neurons are sensing into the environment and checking that it's safe. And that's before whether or not it's safe has become kind of conscious in the brain. So the way that we might scan for safety, we can say that there's 3 different ways that we would scan for safety. So the first way is checking in on our inner experience. So if I feel anxious, then I notice that in the body, and then I would check around me, is there a reason to feel anxious? That's probably quite obvious. But what I think is really interesting is we're also checking in at a subconscious level on the experience of the other person. So what that means is if we're in an exchange with another person and they're feeling anxious, beyond their body language, beyond their words and their behaviours, we can actually feel that their anxiety, and that is potentially going to trigger us to think, okay, is there a reason that it's not safe? So actually we're picking up on each other all the time at this kind of subconscious level. And then we've got the relational experience, which is, what's my relationship with this person? Can I trust them? How have they treated me in the past? Are they behaving in a manner which is typical to them? So we're constantly scanning for safety through these 3 mechanisms. And again, if you think about this in terms of change, often during times of change, if you think about organisational change, you might have people in the organisation that are feeling anxious, and there might be a good reason for that anxiety, or there might not be. They might just be feeling anxious because it's change. But either way, that's going to have an effect on other people. So one of the things that we can do if we want to create calm in an organisation is actually work on being calm ourselves. So just some things about this idea of emotions being contagious. There's some research that shows that there was a piece of research that showed people photos of faces that were, for example, angry or fearful, and it showed that triggered the emotional system just to see that photo. And what we also know is that leaders are particularly contagious. So the mood of the leader is going to be particularly impactful on the rest of the team. And then I also wanted to share this piece of research from you. I don't know if anyone's heard of the HeartMath Institute, which is a really interesting organisation in the US. And they've conducted lots of research looking at the connection between the heart and the brain. And they're interested in this concept of relational energetics, which is basically how we communicate with each other really at the subconscious level, energetically, without saying or doing anything that would be observable. And what they did was they did this experiment where they had 3 people in a meeting who were practicing getting into a state of coherence, so getting into a state of calm and flow, and that could be assessed through measuring their heart rhythms. And what they found was that when these 3 people were intentionally getting into a state of calm and flow, a 4th person who knew nothing of what was happening, their actually heart rhythms changed to match the other 3 and got into a state of flow. So that was really, really amazing research, really, and they've looked at all sorts of things like the electromagnetic field that surrounds the heart center as well as the mind. So they're quite an interesting organisation. So I guess that was my first point, really, was thinking about the idea that at this subconscious level we're always scanning, and that we need to be really mindful of that. In a way, we're primed to look for danger. So it's no wonder that change is going to be a difficult thing. So thinking about some tools that we could use to kind of create that calm for ourselves, so that we then can show up in a calm way for other people, or that we can teach for other people so that they can stay calm. And I wanted to share this very quick coherence technique, so I thought we could just do it together, if that's okay with you. And so what I would, this is going to be 2 minutes. So just before we get started, I would just invite you just to check in with your body and make any adjustments that you need to make, because if we have a body that's well supported, again, that's going to send a signal that it's safe and we can feel calm. So some of the things we can do is check that we're well supported in our chair, that your feet are rooted into the ground. You may want to just roll your shoulders a couple of times, or maybe even let out a sigh, whatever you need to do. And then I'm going to be quiet for 1 minute. And in that 1 minute, what I would invite you to do is just inhale and exhale slowly and more deeply than usual from the heart center. So you could do this on a inhale on a count of 5 and exhale on a count of 5, or whatever rhythm works for you. But I'll be quiet for a minute to allow you to do that. And then I'll talk us to the next part of the meditation. And in the next part of the meditation, for the next 1 minute, I invite you to bring to mind a time when you felt calm and happy, and to hold this in your awareness as you continue to breathe out, in and out from the heart. So again, I'll just be quiet for another minute so that to let you continue with that positive experience in your mind, in your awareness. Okay, so we literally just did 2 minutes of breathing there, and there was 2 parts. One, when I say breathing in from the heart center, I mean imagine just breathing into the heart and exhaling from the heart. So just imagining that as your a sort of sending the energy and the breath to that part of the body. And the second part was about creating a regenerative feeling. So it's a very, very quick way to come back to calm and balance. And as I say, this has been one of the techniques that's been, it's got quite a lot of evidence to show that it works from the HeartMath Institute.
Sarah, can I just ask a quick question? Someone's just put in the chat, what do you mean when you breathe from the center? Is it like lifting up your diaphragm and like accentuating a big breath in?
Just responded to that.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Helen. Yeah, just meant to breathe. Imagine breathing in and out from the heart, basically. Yeah. So I also think, because we're talking about staying calm, I think it's just really important to remind ourselves that actually we've got to remember the basics, right? We've got to remember nutrition, blood sugar levels, eating regularly. We've got to remember rest, sleep, naps. We've got to remember exercise. And also, for me, what I think is really important is this remembering to slow down when we can. it's very difficult for us to nurture a resilient mindset and a resilient way of being if we're not taking care of the basics. Sometimes we can't take care of the basics. Sometimes we're just very, very tired because we're not getting the sleep that we need. And in those instances, I think sometimes we need to try to be a bit kind to ourselves and perhaps modify the expectation that we have of ourselves, because it's just a fact, a brain-based fact, that we're more likely to become negative when we're tired. You know, that's just, I'm sure you've experienced that. And another tool which I think is really important for resilience that I wanted to share with you is this is like a visual map of a personal ecosystem. So what this is, it on the right hand side it's kind of personal life, and on the left hand side it's kind of professional life. And the idea is that you create a map of all of the factors in your life, the aspects of your life that are either uplifting and nourishing or draining. Okay, so you could complete it with whatever colours that you want. So what this person has done, Anna, is she's created it with different colours, but the grey areas, you can see their stress, energy drain and sleep are the areas that she's really trying to work on in terms of minimising. They're the areas that she really doesn't want in her life, she wants to change. And the areas that are in red are also areas that she needs to work on, but they're not necessarily negative, but they're more to be aware of. So she's doing some work around purpose, she's doing some work on her spending time in nature, and she's got some sadness going on to do with her family, which she's not necessarily said is a bad thing, but it's something that she's kind of processing. So the reason why I wanted to share this, there's sort of two things really to say about this. First of all, our personal ecosystem is so important in terms of our resilience. So we live in a world that's quite hyper individual, and it's really, really important to remember that actually we can't sustain ourselves on our own. We're intimately interconnected with the world around us and people around us. And so checking in every so often on our ecosystem and checking that it is actually nourishing us and not draining us is something that can be really helpful to do. And the second thing I want to say about this is there's a reason why we've done it as a visual map, because it's said that the visual is a way into the subconscious. So if you were to ever try to do something like this, you might be surprised that it kind of teaches you something or tells you about something that perhaps you weren't previously aware of at a conscious level. So, and just in terms of the lines, you can see there's kind of different thicknesses, and they could represent the quality of the relationship as well. So we've already covered a couple of tools. I hope this is making sense, because what I'm trying to do as we go through is cover the theory and then kind of link it to a few tools. So the first one we've really been looking at is that, just as a kind of reminder, is that we're constantly scanning. Change creates fear, and so we're trying to develop this basic level of resilience. But the second principle that I said I wanted to look at is further this idea that change is just hard. And I'm going to link this to Maslow's hierarchy, which is quite an old model now. It comes from the 1970s, but I think it depicts really well our basic human needs. So we could say, you know, basic food, water, shelter, security, stability, love, connection, belonging, esteem, status, and self-actualization and purpose. And we can see that during periods of change, each of these has the potential of being disrupted. So if we're talking about organizational change, the first question that usually comes into people's heads is, what's going to happen to my job? Like, will I still have a job? But even if you are hopefully staying within the organization, there might be a change to your job. Or you might end up working with different people, for example. So that's going to potentially be a challenge for this love, connection and belonging, because we might have to stop working with certain people and start working with other people. And that just takes a bit of time to adjust. We might lose people from the organisation. This hierarchy has been criticised because what Maslow argued was that we needed the lower level needs to be met before we could go to the higher level needs. So in other words, we needed to have food, water, shelter needs met before we could move on to security, before we could experience love and connection. But what we now know is that love and connection is absolutely fundamental to survival. And so it doesn't necessarily work in that hierarchical way, but I still think it's a good model because it shows us the different needs that we have and how each of them can be impacted by changes that happen in life and at work. And much of the reason why change is hard is, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, is because it creates uncertainty, and we actually favour certainty. We're designed to favour certainty. So if we look, again mentioning the chimp paradox, Professor Steve Peters, and he talks about these different parts of our brain. He talks about the rational brain and the emotional brain. And they focus on different things. So the rational brain wants to focus on facts and truth, while the emotional brain is focused on feelings. The rational brain is logical thinking, the emotional brain is emotional thinking. But both of them want to plan for the future. And again, change is going to thwart that ability to plan and predict, which is central to our kind of survival. And change is often, because of the fact it creates uncertainty, it can often be resisted, even when we know the change is a positive thing. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the expression, better the devil we know. And of course, that expression comes from the idea that sometimes or often we're more likely to stay in a situation that it's not good for us. Again, you might relate to that. We sometimes stay in situations that aren't good for us because there's something about change and the unknown, which is quite tricky for us to sort of manage. So going back to then the neuroscience. So we've talked about the different functions of the brain. We've talked about the nervous system. And this is a different kind of way of looking at the brain, which is looking at the limbic system, which is the emotional structure of the brain. And particularly the amygdala, which is helps to process our emotional experience and is sort of roughly in the centre of the brain. I want to say that emotions are actually incredibly important. So I think sometimes we have a focus in our society to be very logical. But actually, emotions are really important. You know, if we didn't have emotions, it would be very, very difficult to ever make a decision because we wouldn't know what our preferences were, for example. Carl Jung said that our emotions were our ethical kind of or moral compass, you know. So emotions are really, really important. However, in high stress situations, sometimes our emotions can become quite triggered. And in those situations, sometimes they can override our logic. And that is what we might call an amygdala hijack or an emotional hijack. And the classic example that's always used is sending the angry email and then later regretting it. But I always like to think of other examples, you know, like maybe we're receiving some constructive feedback or some bad news and we can't stop crying. And we wish that I facilitate sessions on feedback and difficult conversations. And people often say to me, how can I have this conversation without crying? Well, it's very difficult because if the emotion's there, you know, then and the emotion's strong, it's very difficult to have control over that. It needs to be kind of nurtured and developed over time. So again, if we're being triggered by a change in the workplace or in life, it's quite good to be aware that if we're finding it difficult, we can't just easily shut down those emotions, which is where we come to the change curve. So the change curve, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she originally wrote about grief. So these are the processes, the typical experiences that we go through when we're going through grief. But actually, it's been found to be quite relevant for change, other kinds of change and change in the workplace. Excuse me. So again, you might relate to this, where in the beginning we might be in denial and shock. Then we might have experiences of anger and anxiety or depression and low mood. and hopefully eventually we move on to acceptance. We choose to commit to the new state, and we begin to learn and adapt for the future. It's not linear. So the other thing is we're just human, right? We're messy humans, so we tend to jump around these different stages. Also, the amount of time that it takes, excuse me, is going to vary from person to person. And so if you're very quick to move through change, some of us are naturally going to find it easier to move through change than others. If you're very quick to move through change, you might find it hard to understand why somebody else is for example, stays in anger or anxiety for such a long period of time. The other thing that I think is great about this change curve is that it enables us to label where we are, which helps to create self-awareness, which helps us to understand what we need in that particular moment. So if we notice that we're feeling particularly angry, we might want to kind of go and have a rant to somebody, a friend or a colleague, before we go into that meeting with our manager, for example. Also, what the science shows us is that when we're able to label our emotions, it actually reduces the intensity. So it's quite important to be able to talk about our emotions. Excuse me. And so I think it's quite helpful from that point of view as well. And then the second tool in terms of working through difficult emotions is this fly on the wall technique, which is literally, it's one of my favorite tools, and it comes from neuroscientist Ethan Kross. He wrote a brilliant book called Chatter. And the tool is that you imagine you're a fly on the wall looking across at yourself, and then you talk about yourself in the third person. So if I'm Sean, I imagine I'm a fly on the wall, and I start saying things like, Sean is feeling anxious, Sean's feeling angry, Sean can't believe what that person just said to him in that meeting, and now he's wondering what to do. And what this does is it actually reduces the emotional activation in the brain, thereby creating an emotional distance from the situation. So it's a bit like, how it's when you look at other people's problems, it's often much easier to find solutions and be clear-headed. And when you're in the problem, sometimes it's really hard to work it out. It's a bit like that, because you've got more emotional distance. Sometimes it's easier to give another person advice or to follow, you can't understand why they're perhaps not seeing that advice or following that route, which seems really obvious to you. So it's a great way to create that emotional distance. Okay, I better get a move on because we're at 7:10 already. So the other thing, so we've talked about calming the nervous system and the basics of resilience. We've talked about the emotional brain and tools for working with that constructively. And now what I want to talk about is the logical brain, okay? So even when we are thinking logically, our logical brain does tend to take shortcuts. So if you look at this visual, it's an optical illusion which suggests that the lines are different lengths. And actually, if you were to measure it, you would find that the lines are the same length. However, to measure the lines, obviously it's more effortful than just to look at the lines. So that's just an example. Our brain kind of automatically goes to this shortcut and comes up with something that actually isn't true. And that's a very natural thing that our brain does. And actually, it's a very, very helpful thing. So this ability to take shortcuts actually helps us to really process often very complex information, such as being able to read this jumbled paragraph. So what we know is that as long as the first letter and the last letter of each word are in the right place, we can actually read most words, which I just think is amazing when I saw this. So it's a brilliant thing that our brain can take shortcuts. But the point I'm trying to make here is that we have to be careful that we don't create false narratives through that shortcut thinking. And that's really what Daniel Kahneman was talking about in his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. So this system 1 is the fast, unconscious, automatic way of thinking, which is really good for everyday decision and everyday thinking. We couldn't possibly pay lots of attention to every single thing that we're engaged with every day because we'd be too overwhelmed. However, where system 1 can't work it out, it will defer to system 2, which is much slower, but it's conscious, effortful, and it's very, very good for complex decision making. So, however, sometimes system 1 doesn't know that it's wrong, right? So it thinks it's found the answer, it thinks it's made sense, but it's created a false narrative. So to link this back to change, where there's missing information, often without even realizing it, we could be filling in those gaps of information, creating a narrative which may or may not be true. And because we tend to be more sensitive to threats, and especially during times of change, that narrative is more likely to be quite a negative narrative. And again, there'll be very individual differences with this, but that can be a mechanism that can happen. And it's one of the reasons why any kind of organizational change programs, they're always talking about make sure you share information regularly, thoroughly, etc., etc. But again, I'm coming at this from the point of view of what can we do for ourselves. So my sort of invitation for you, if you ever find yourself in this situation, is to think about, well, what can I do to fill in those missing gaps of information, and perhaps to double check the narrative that you have, the scripts that you have, and sort of fact check it for truth. So there's things that we can do for ourselves as well. And so a tool that we could think about, so sometimes when, especially with change, if we feel like change has been done to us, we can feel quite like we have no control over the situation. And so I like this tool, the circle of control, which comes from Stephen Covey, which is a nice one to help us think about, actually, there's still quite a lot that we have control over. So we could have control over, like, asking for more information. We could have control over giving ourselves time, or saying what we need, articulating what we need to those people around us. We might even have some control or influence over the kinds of changes that are taking place. But also, just as important is recognizing what I might need to let go of. Because when I look at this, it always makes me think of like ancient sort of wisdom coming from places like Buddhism and Islam, because often there's a focus on letting go. I'm sure there's something in Buddhism which is around suffering. A lot of suffering is around not being able to, trying to control things that we can't control. And it's about letting go. So being able to let go of things that we can't control is a really, really important thing in terms of our own well-being and our own happiness. And it means we're not going to spend a lot of time wasting energy trying to control things that we can't control. And this sounds really obvious, I think, but it's quite difficult to do it in practice. So I can think of many times in my life when I've caught myself trying to control things, and it's a process to learn not to do that, I think. I know there's some questions coming in, and I will have a look at the end, but I just want to get us through. So I'm hoping the pace is okay. I'm going to be talking for about another 5-10 minutes. Another tool that I like is sometimes when we notice that we have a narrative that isn't true or which is unhelpful, we immediately try to change it. And that can be a really good thing. And I'm going to be talking about a tool we can use to reframe our thinking a bit later. However, I'm always a little bit cautious, because we know how strong emotions are, and we know how, strong our resistance can be. Sometimes it doesn't really work to kind of force that change. We know the narrative's not helpful, but sometimes it doesn't help. It's difficult to change that narrative. And so I like this tool, which is thinking about unhelpful narratives as being like loyal soldiers. So if we take some very common unhelpful narratives, so these are kind of typical saboteurs, brain saboteurs or ways of thinking, which could go into overdrive during times of stress or transition. So some of these ones, I must be perfect, I never get it right, I have to be in control, I need people to like me, or being a people pleaser. If you think about these narratives as being like loyal soldiers, it can be really, really helpful. So as an example, if I take being perfect, I might notice that I have perfectionist tendencies and it's causing me a lot of stress and anxiety. But actually that perfectionism is probably trying to protect me from the criticism of others or being rejected by others. Or there's some reason why it exists, right? That it's trying to protect us. And so if that's true, I think that's a really, really good logical argument for why we need to be kind to ourselves, because why would we be really nasty to the loyal, which we often are to ourselves? We often tell ourselves, don't think like that, don't be ridiculous, you know, just stop it. Whereas why would we be nasty like that to a kind of a loyal soldier? So this tool is more around, okay, so I've got this perfectionism. So I begin by asking, is the war over? In other words, do I actually really need to be perfect in this situation? Or can I allow myself to just be a little bit more relaxed? And if I find that the war is over and it's okay to not be 100% perfect, rather than just immediately trying to change that narrative or that way of being, I actually spend quite a bit of time in gratitude, thanking that loyal soldier for their service, thanking them for protecting me. And then I spend a bit of time inviting them to stand down and reminding ourselves that we don't need to be perfect anymore. So you can really do this with anything, but just sort of, I suppose, linking it back to change. If I was feeling angry, say, about a change, I might want to ask myself, do I really need to be angry? You know, or maybe it's fair enough that the change is happening. But actually the anger's there to protect me, so I can spend just a bit of time thanking the anger rather than just telling it immediately to go away. I can spend a bit of time thanking it and telling it that it's okay. It doesn't need to protect me. It doesn't need to be angry, because I can actually protect myself with my calm, from my calm centered self. So hopefully that makes sense. And I like this one because I think it's about developing that self-compassion.
Sarah, can I just ask, is the loyal soldier a little bit of an example of imposter syndrome, which is very common in the tech industry?
It could be. It could. I mean, we've all got loyal soldiers, which are, I don't want to say inaccurate, I would say unhelpful ways of thinking. Unhelpful ways of thinking, which will have developed as a form of defense mechanism early on in life. We've all got them, every single one of them, and they've protected us, and they're often really, really good. But then at some stage in life, they might not help us anymore.
Okay.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, so this is my final section, so please bear with me. And this is about neuroplasticity. So now I want to talk about, well, actually, once we've calmed the nervous system, once we've worked with our emotions, once we've given ourselves time, because change is hard, and once we've checked in with our faulty thinking, we might actually want to spend a bit of time influencing our brain, our nervous system, and the way that we think. So I just say something at this point about the neural brain network. So we looked at the brain earlier. This is a different way of looking at the brain, which is actually looking at it in terms of neural pathways. So we have something like 86 billion neurons in our brain, which is just incredible. We've also got, like, I think 100 million in our gut. And I can't remember how many in our heart, but sometimes they're called the second and the third brain because we have those throughout the body. And actually, more important, we could say, than the functions of the brain is the way that the different parts of the brain connect through this through these neural pathways. And the way that neurons connect is they communicate by sending electrochemical signals across what's called a synaptic cleft. So they're not physically connected, but they send signals, electrochemical signals. And the pathways which are most used form stronger connections. So in other words, so just a really simple example of this is, glass half full, glass half empty. If we choose to see positive, we're more likely to see positive because those neuron pathways are better trodden and easier to travel along than thinking sort of pessimistically. So that is really the essence of growth mindset. You might have come across growth mindset, Carol Dweck, which is essentially this idea that intelligence can grow. So we used to think that the brain grew and evolved until about the age of 25. And after that, it was stable until it kind of went downhill. But we now know that our brain continues to evolve for the whole of our lives. And that's why we can, excuse me, I've got a real tickle in my throat. That's why people, for example, have the ability to recover after a stroke. Obviously, we've got to be a bit careful because we don't have full control. So that's why I think all of the other strategies that I've been talking about are really helpful. We can't just say, okay, we've got control over how the brain grows. So, I shouldn't need to feel like that, or I shouldn't need to think that. It takes time to kind of nurture and create new ways of thinking. But growth mindset is essentially this idea that I can change. My brain can change. So just to share like an example of this was a mindfulness study that took place at Massachusetts University in 2011. And they had 18 people that joined a mindfulness program. And they underwent brain scans along with a further 15 people. So they had 33 people in total, 18 of which went through a mindfulness program and 15 of which didn't. And then they contrasted the brains at the end. And what they found was that there was greater grey matter and cortisol thickness in the parts of the brain for those that had been through the mindfulness program. So we're actually seeing physical changes in the brain. And I think this was after something like 6 weeks or something. They actually saw physical changes in the brain. So it can happen really quite quickly. And again, that's going to create that foundation of resilience. So as well as mindfulness, this could be another technique. You might have heard of cognitive reframe techniques. So this is the ABC model. And it's the idea that there's an activating event, for an example, an office move. We might have some beliefs around that. I'm going to hate the new office. And the consequences, we're more likely to hate it. We're going to resist the change and we're going to see the negatives. So really simple. We might just want to replace that with, for example, replace the belief with curiosity. We're trying to see an advantage. And the consequences, we're likely to be more open and maybe even enjoy the shift. And then this is the final piece of research that I wanted to share with you. This comes from Positive Intelligence. And this was around if we, I think this was a period of about 3 weeks. If we perform one of these habits each day, just for a few minutes, it actually had a significant improvement in optimism. So I thought that I could actually finish by inviting you to share in the chat something that you're grateful for in life, just because we know this is a habit to build positivity. And just while you're doing that, I'm going to have a look at the chat that's been coming through already. Oh, Jim, I've just seen your comment there. Terrifyingly exciting. It's a great way of putting it. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's quite a lot there for me to think about. So I won't go through everything. So I don't, unfortunately, we haven't got time for the breakout space that I was hoping for. But what I'll just do is, by way of summary slides, this is really what we've covered. So we've covered the 5 fundamentals, brain-based fundamentals, and what I've tried to do is kind of link it to tools that we might be able to use that's going to support ourselves and help to lead ourselves through change. So I'd love to pause there and just see if anybody has any questions or any thoughts or any reflections from what I've been talking about.
I have a question. You talked about when we looked at the neural pathways, how those that are more commonly used become stronger. So in terms of positive thinking, if we have that positive mindset, that will grow. Is that kind of where the concept of manifestation comes from? When you're sort of being positive and sort of
really
manifesting something.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I think first of all, it's really important to say that we have an element of control over the way that our brain develops. But I think we just need to be careful that we don't put too much pressure on ourselves as well. In terms of manifestation, my understanding, and other people might have, chime in please if you've got a different view. I think neuroplasticity can help us because, for example, if we practice gratitude and write down 3 things that we notice that were positive every day, we are then more likely to see those things in the world, which means we're more likely to be positive and uplifted, and we're more likely to then, people feel that, right? Because we know it's contagious, and then we're more likely to receive that. So that would be one version of manifestation. There are other people that would talk about probably things beyond what we talked about today, like the universe, the way the universe works, and that's more like the metaphysical level. So I couldn't really comment on that. Does that make sense to you?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah.
Over to you, Robert.
Yeah, thanks very much for your reflection on all these topics. Big topic. I have a question about your third point, the emotional brain can dominate.
Yes.
When you started to talk about that subject, you talked about the importance of the emotions.
Yes.
But then when you talked about tools that you can use, they were all tools that concern limiting the emotional response to situations. So I'm a little confused there.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's both. I think when we have, this again, feel free if you have a different perspective, but this would just be my comment on it. I think that when we have a strong emotion, we know from the research that it's not good to suppress emotion anyway. But I also know from personal experience, both in terms of my own life, but people that I've supported through coaching and so on, that processing, allowing emotion just to be is really important. And in fact, he talks about that in the chimp paradox. He talks about emotions need a place. And I'm also a big believer in the wisdom of emotions. That is true, absolutely. I'm thinking of a book called Feeling Wisdom, which explores emotions from a psychoanalytical point of view, which I really liked. However, at the same time, I also think it's true that sometimes our emotions become so strong that they overwhelm us, and it becomes difficult for us to make decisions or approach things. So I think there's something about making space for emotion and also sometimes keeping it a little bit in check. It's kind of both, but it's knowing what we need at any given moment, because I think if we're highly emotional or something's really triggered us, it's not very kind or it's not very helpful just to try and manage it in that moment. We might need to give ourselves a bit of space. Or it might be in that moment, it's better to use one of the techniques for managing. Does that make sense? Have I kind of answered that? Or is it, what does that bring up for you?
Well, it's a very, very big topic, and I thank you for that additional perspective on it. I suppose that you need to think first about who you are in terms of the balance between emotional reflection and logical reflection on issues, and in function of that, take steps to achieve the equilibrium you're talking about.
Absolutely. And we also had different ways of processing emotion, right? Because some of us need to talk, some of us need to cry, some of us just want to go and, I don't know, play golf or go to the gym or something. We don't need to talk about it at all. So that's important as well. We're all different.
Brilliant. Petra says, can we see again the slide with the multiple techniques for gratitude close to the end?
Yes, this one.
Yeah, there we go. We'll leave it on the screen and I'll ask you another one. So Tomo's asking, your presentation of the research is great, but how should we use this to gently create change?
Who was that from, sorry?
That was from Tomo.
Tomo. To gently create change. So you're talking about leaders in organizations. Well,
and agile coaches and scrum masters.
Yeah. Sorry?
And agile coaches and scrum masters and those people who have technical things they'd like to bring about.
I think that's a really big question. I feel like I could do the whole presentation again, but from that perspective about what it means for people who are overseeing change. Because I guess I've tried to come at it today from the perspective of how do I manage it if change is being done to me? So I think a lot of what I've talked about, the science is the same, but maybe the strategies that I would use are different in a way. So for example, if you took something like the change curve, if you were leading change, it might be enough for you, if you knew about the change curve, you might be able to observe other people and think, okay, that's where they're at the moment. So that means this is how if they're in an anxious mood, I probably need to create a forum where they can perhaps talk about it, just give them space to reflect and process. Or I could even show them, in a team meeting or something, we could even go through the change curve and get people to kind of self-identify if that would, if that felt like it would land well with the team. I think the being calm ourselves is really important. That bit we were talking about at the beginning, the relational energetics as well, if we can.
Got another question for you. Do you think hypnotherapy can help change neural pathways?
Oh, I don't know. Do you? Probably. I don't know much of the research behind that.
That was from Barbara.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because hypnotherapy relaxes you. And I would argue, I don't know about the research behind this, but I would imagine that if when we're relaxed, it's easier for our for shifts to take place. Yeah, I'd be interested in anybody else's thoughts on that.
Have we got any more questions coming in?
Yeah, Shanine is asking, you made some great book references. What would be your number one recommendation? So if you had to pick one.
Oh, my favourite book that I've read over the last few years is the one I was talking about, The Loyal Soldier. And he is written by a guy called Bill Plotkin. It's called Wild Mind. And it's a nature-based map of the psyche, which I love. And so it's nature-based. It's got north, east, south, and west. And in the middle, you've got ego. And basically, you want all the facets to be in balance. But the north is about logic, intelligence, nurturing. The south is about kind of sensuality and freedom and fun and enjoying life. The east is about being it's sort of being they call it it's childlike, the innocent or the fool. Sorry, The Innocent or the Sage, I think it is. And then the West is about our shadow self, which I think is really interesting. The shadow parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that we've chosen to repress or suppress, and what the gifts that might lie in the shadow. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's one of my favorite books.